Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Beneath the shelter of the heavens. We turn our gaze now toward the great water, the vast, warm expanse known to some as the Indian Ocean, where the stars were not mere lights in the darkness, but navigational lanterns guiding the heart of the world's commerce. This sea was not ruled by kings or empires, but by the breath of the sky itself, the alternating, majestic rhythm of the monsoon winds that dictated the pace of trade, life, and destiny for countless generations who followed the coastline, linking east to west in a slow, cyclical rhythm of exchange. Upon this shimmering silk of water sailed vessels of profound simplicity, the enduring dhows and sambooks, crafted often without iron nails, their planks stitched together with the durable coconut core of the southern shores, swaying gently beneath great triangular lateen sails that captured the winds with deceptive efficiency. These were not ships of war, but humble carriers of comfort and flavor, navigated by men whose skin held the sun's deep tan, speaking a melody of languages, Swahili, Gujarati, Arabic, Persian, yet sharing the universal dialect of the sea and the quiet calculation of tide and current. The true genius of the route lay not just in the precious cargo, but in the peaceful harmony of these cosmopolitan crews, men who trusted the strength of their shared purpose far more than the fleeting promises of terrestrial lords, bound by the unwritten laws of mutual survival upon the vast, featureless deep. What treasure, you ask, compelled men to spend months away from the sight of familiar hearths, risking shipwreck and piracy in pursuit of unseen wealth that lay scattered like aromatic dust across the globe? It was the spice, the concentrated essence of the earth's warmth, a mere handful of black peppercorns from Malabar, or the fragrant woody curls of cinnamon bark from Lanka that often outweighed gold itself in the distant markets of Alexandria and Rome. These tiny fragments held immense power, not just to flavor a monotonous meal or preserve meat against the summer heat, but to define status, to heal the sick, and to perfume the sacred temples of the known world, transforming daily life across continents with their pungent, exotic magic that promised wealth and well-being. Imagine standing upon the ancient quay of the Malabar coast, perhaps in the famed port of Muziris or Calicut, as the ships are loaded just as the great southwestern monsoon wind begins its long, predictable sigh, signaling the time for departure. The air hangs thick and heavy, saturated with the competing aromas of ginger roots stacked high in woven baskets, cardamom pods being expertly dried in the relentless sun, and the damp, metallic smell of the incoming tide mixing with the lingering, sharp scent of sandalwood harvested far inland. Here, the voices of merchants are sharp and fast, conducting intricate trades involving gleaming copper ingots, bolts of fine Chinese silk that had traveled overland for months, and rough-cut Ethiopian ivory, creating a symphony of global exchange that existed entirely outside the cumbersome jurisdiction of distant, self-proclaimed imperial decree. The loading process itself was a profound, patient ritual, overseen by experienced elders who ensured that the weight was distributed perfectly beneath the waterline, knowing that any imbalance could spell disaster when the open sea turned tempestuous. Every sack of pepper, every bundle of lacquer, and every jar of ghee had been meticulously accounted for and logged onto palm leaf records carried by the nakuda, the captain, whose life and reputation rested upon delivering the goods safely to the Arabian Gulf or the shores of East Africa. As the last ropes were cast off and the sails caught the wind, the rhythmic drumming and chanting of farewells echoed across the water, carrying the hope and anxiety of entire communities dependent on the success of the annual passage. Once the sails were taut and the familiar coast receded into a thin, blurring line of memory, the journey became a profound act of sustained faith, a measured dance across an endless blue expanse where the horizon was the only reliable marker of continuity. The true masters of this passage were the captains, men whose intimate knowledge of the stars, The subtle shift in water color and the migratory paths of birds was passed down through generations, allowing them to read the invisible currents and anticipate the rare, sudden squalls that could devour a heavily laden vessel in mere moments. They navigated by the faint, shimmering reflection of the moon upon the waves, the temperature of the water beneath their hand, and the quiet murmuring of the stitched planks beneath their feet, trusting implicitly that the powerful wind which carried them away would eventually, inevitably, bring them home again months later when the opposite wind returned. The first great stopping place on the Western Arc was often the storied coast of Arabia, the lands of frankincense and myrrh, perhaps at the bustling port of Aden or Muscat, where the atmosphere shifted drastically from humid tropical growth to arid, baked desert heat, and the color of the sea changed from deep sapphire to shimmering turquoise over the coastal shoals. Here, the spice cargo was carefully counted, verified against the original manifests, and resorted, some destined to travel further overland via resilient camel caravan across the formidable Rub al-Khali desert to reach the markets of Petra or Palmyra. The remainder awaited the next leg of the sea journey toward the Red Sea entry points, where yet another civilization, the Egyptian, stood ready to receive and tax the exotic bounty before sending it onward to the Mediterranean world. The ships were reloaded in these Arabian harbors, not only with the desert's precious resins, essential for healing unguents and temple offerings throughout the Greek and Roman territories, but also with fine breeding horses destined for Indian courts, polished pearls pulled from the deep Gulf waters, and the concentrated, sweet nourishment of sun-dried dates, preparing the crews for the final, often treacherous, push toward the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This bottleneck, the Gate of Tears, was known for its fickle currents and the dangers of shallow reefs, requiring every ounce of skill and shared reverence for the sea's power that the diverse crew possessed to guide their precious cargo through the constricted passage. As the trading cycle matured, these sea lanes ensured that ideas, philosophies, and religious narratives traveled alongside the heavy sacks of cinnamon and the fragile baskets of ginger root, weaving a tapestry of shared culture across a vast geographical sweep. The routes were not merely economic conduits. They were the essential arteries carrying the vital, unseen flow of civilization itself, linking the meditation halls of India with the libraries of Alexandria and the marketplaces of Zanzibar. The true history of the Indian Ocean is thus a history written not in the hardened granite monuments of terrestrial empire, but upon the fluid, shifting surface of the sea, carried by the humble, enduring lateen sail and the relentless, patient passage of seasonal time. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The sailor's existence was not ruled by the decrees of faraway kings or the proclamations of coastal governors, but entirely by the rhythmic, undeniable breath of the Mausam, the seasonal wind that determined all possibility and failure in this vast oceanic theater. For 6 sustained months, the great southwesterly pushed the sleek, single-masted dhows rapidly toward the eastern shores, carrying the distinct scent of salt and profound distance. Then, after a required period of anxious waiting, intense trading, and ship repair, the gentle northeast wind would beckon them homeward across the open expanse, signaling the time to gather fortunes and return to loved ones. To misread the signs of this atmospheric sovereign, or to delay departure by even a few crucial weeks once the wind began to shift, meant being forced to wait an entire half-year in a foreign land, a potentially ruinous risk few seasoned captains would ever dare to take, for the sea grants passage only when it is pleased to do so. Imagine the sheer spectacle of the harbor of Muziris, or perhaps the bustling quays of Kolum further south, during the peak season when the vessels arrived heavy and full, a confluence of cultures and goods that defied easy description. Here, the fresh, earthy scent of inland pepper vines mingled with the briny tang of the incoming tide, the sharp aroma of burning sandalwood used in temple ceremonies, and the smoky residue of cooking fires from 100 different hearths, all competing for prominence. The great timber vessels, carved from cedar or teak, lay deep in the water, their massive lateen sails neatly furled high upon the yardarm, guarded by men speaking tongues that sounded like water flowing over stones. Tamil, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew, all momentarily united by the harsh but efficient language of trade and mutual necessity. On the quays themselves, organized chaos reigned as bustling laborers, supervised by watchful, ledger-holding merchants, carefully managed the arduous and physically demanding task of inventory, valuation, and negotiation for the goods destined for Roman tables. Every measure of saffron, every fragile basket of ginger root, and every coil of precious raw silk was meticulously accounted for, ensuring that not a single pinch of valuable cargo was lost amidst the frantic, high-stakes exchange before the goods were loaded onto smaller riverboats for inland transit. It was here, standing shoulder to shoulder with the captains, that the true wealth of the world could be momentarily gauged, measured not just in gold, but in the accumulated effort of thousands of hands across hundreds of miles of perilous water and thick jungle terrain. The knowledge that guided these vessels across the open, featureless ocean was not bound within hefty scrolls or stored in monumental public libraries, but rested lightly upon the memory, intuition, and lived experience of the seasoned Nahuda, the captain whose lineage often stretched back through countless successful and harrowing crossings. He read the waves not as formless, shifting water, but as vital, tangible messengers telling tales of distant shores, hidden reefs, and the temper of the approaching weather front, relying entirely upon the movements of the celestial clock above. Using the star paths, particularly the dependable sweep of the Southern Cross and the consistent height of Polaris, to navigate the deep ocean where no land was visible for weeks on end, these masters of the sea carried within them the ancient wisdom of the celestial sphere and the deep, abiding patience of the desert traveler, combining practical astronomy with an almost spiritual reverence for the tides. Once the initial coastal trade was complete and the highly coveted spices were secured, the true inland journey of distribution began, a complicated ballet of transport that extended the ocean's immediate reach deep into the continent's heart, threading the wealth through thick forests and across dry plains. Massive, patient elephants were often employed as the primary beasts of burden, carrying enormous bales of prized black pepper and heavy sacks of fragrant cardamom pods from the humid jungle highlands down to the bustling river depots further inland, where smaller, shallower craft awaited. This complex transfer system ensured that even the most remote villages along the great rivers, the Indus, the Ganga, or the far-reaching tributaries of the Nile, could access the vital warmth of ginger root or the ceremonial fragrance of true cinnamon, turning the exotic into the necessary. Within these polyglot port cities, a marvelous and rare synthesis of cultures occurred with a fluidity unseen anywhere else in the ancient world, as transient sailors often adopted the local textiles and resident merchants absorbed aspects of foreign deities into their domestic protective shrines. A heavy silver coin minted under the Roman Emperor Augustus, clearly stamped with his stern profile, might be spent easily on exquisite local jewelry crafted with techniques learned from Persian artisans who had settled there generations ago, while a physician from Yemen studied the intricate healing properties described in ancient Sanskrit texts. The very cuisine of the coastal regions spoke volumes about this blending, successfully combining the fiery heat of Indian chilies with the slow, savory cooking methods introduced by Arabian travelers, creating dishes that belonged uniquely to the coastal crossroads, existing neither fully as food of the East nor strictly of the West. As the trading season drew inexorably toward its close, and the monsoon was poised to shift its direction, the great ships began their slow, deliberate preparation for the arduous westward voyage, the newly secured hulls now riding slightly higher in the water with the accumulated weight of goods destined for the Red Sea ports and beyond. They were laden with precious ivory tusks, shimmering bolts of fine silk woven in the distant lands of Serica, And, most importantly for the stability of the entire vast trade system, immense quantities of raw gold and silver Roman coinage. This wealth, often melted down and swiftly recast locally into easily manageable bars, always represented the vast financial outflow from the Western Mediterranean economies, fueling the trade further. The captains would anxiously watch the shifting constellations and feel the subtle change in the air's temperature, noting the minute alterations in the prevailing wind's direction, knowing they had only a brief, essential window of opportunity before the mighty monsoon turned utterly and decisively against them, rendering passage impossible. This waiting demanded enormous patience and deep fortitude as they anchored, often for weeks, praying for the final auspicious moment to set sail and brave the long journey back toward the familiar, protective anchorages of Muscat and Aden before rounding the long, arid curve of the Arabian Peninsula. This relentless and often brutal cycle of departure and return demanded a profound spiritual discipline and intense emotional resilience from the sailors, and perhaps even more so from their waiting families, who lived constantly beneath the long shadow of separation and potential permanent loss upon the waves. Wives and small children would often gather near the water's edge at dawn, offering small protective prayers to the sea deities and carefully placing offerings of flowers upon the outgoing tide, knowing intimately that the immense riches carried by the great dhows were purchased not just with Western gold, but with the courage, sheer skill, and unwavering endurance of the men facing the open, silent, and often unforgiving abyss. The profitability of a pouch of cinnamon in the marketplaces of Rome was thus inextricably tied to the intimate anxieties experienced by a fisherman's family waiting patiently for a single, known masthead to appear on the horizon, signaling a triumphant and mercifully safe return. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The triumphant arrival of the fleet after months spent braving the churning silence of the sea was not a quiet affair, but a roaring spectacle of coordinated chaos, a frantic ballet orchestrated by whistles, loud cries, and the deep, booming reverberation of heavy timber against the stone quays of the Arabian Gulf ports. As the sailors secured the thick hemp ropes, the air, previously clean and salted by the open ocean, now became heavy with the mingled scents of human sweat, burning charcoal, drying fish, and the truly intoxicating, precious aroma of the cargo itself. The overwhelming perfume of clove, cardamom, and pepper carried on the land breeze like a visible golden mist promising vast fortune. Upon these busy stone-paved docks, where the hot, dry air of the peninsula met the humid, tropical breath of the Indian Ocean, the silent gamble endured upon the waves was finally paid out, and the true measure of their successful passage was counted in the weight, purity, and sheer volume of the tightly bound sacks they hauled ashore. Here, amidst the clamor of a dozen different tongues, stood the formidable merchant lords, often draped in fine linens and wearing the heavy, conspicuous rings signifying their immense wealth, whose keen and discerning eyes could instantly judge the quality of a single pepperberry or the age of a stick of cinnamon merely by the color and its inherent scent. The negotiations over a single shipload could often stretch across several slow-moving, heated days, punctuated by solemn oaths sworn upon sacred texts and the shared, sweet ritual of coffee served in tiny, ornate cups. For these transactions were never merely exchanges of coinage, but profound and intricate agreements of trust that upheld the very fragile structure of the trading world. The final price agreed upon for the precious cargo had to accurately compensate for the cost of the ship's upkeep, the salaries of 100 sailors, the long period of enforced waiting, and the fierce, relentless demands of the desert tribes who lay in ambush further along the inland routes that awaited the goods. Once released from the humid darkness of the dhow's holds, The precious, fragrant bulk of the cargo began its secondary, equally perilous pilgrimage, moving irrevocably away from the comforting salt spray toward the scorching, boundless reaches of the land, where the next phase of the journey was entrusted to new hands and new hazards. These overland trails, which followed ancient riverbeds or cleaved their way through the desolate terrain toward the great inland markets of Mesopotamia and the distant Levant, were the domain of the patient caravan masters and the tireless, sturdy camels, who served as the indispensable ships of the desert, replacing the timber vessels of the sea. The melodic, rhythmic chime of the camel bells now replaced the groaning creak of the mast and the slap of the water against the hull, marking the slow, steady, and often agonizing progress through sun-blasted landscapes utterly devoid of the life-giving moisture that had dominated the earlier, vast segment of the trade route. The dangers here were of a fundamentally different, more immediate, and intensely terrestrial nature than the sudden, overwhelming fury of the monsoon squall experienced upon the open water, manifesting instead as the silent, parching thirst that could wither a man's strength and spirit in mere hours, or the sudden, violent appearance of masked nomadic raiders. These fierce, mobile tribes viewed the immense wealth carried by the caravans, the silks, the jewels, the dried spices, as nothing less than their own due tribute, and their attacks were swift, brutal, and often carried out under the cover of the desert's howling, blinding dust storms. Guards were hired not merely for their proven skill with a longbow or a sharp scimitar, but crucially for their intimate, generations-old knowledge of the hidden, life-saving wells, and their ability to navigate the ever-shifting, confusing labyrinth of the immense sand dunes. Guards were hired not merely for their proven skill with a longbow or a sharp scimitar, but crucially for their intimate, generations-old knowledge of the hidden, life-saving wells and their ability to navigate the ever-shifting, confusing labyrinth of the immense sand dunes. Yet, the rewards reaped at the terminus of this daunting trek were always commensurate with the peril faced. For the fine muslin cloth from the East and the rare, dark gum of myrrh and frankincense would eventually fetch exorbitant, unimaginable prices in the distant, cool stone marketplaces of Palmyra, Antioch, and the grand, sophisticated trading centers along the Mediterranean Sea. Consider, then, the miraculous continuity and delicate complexity of this entire journey. The slender, climbing pepper vine, tended by a humble farmer under the gaze of the tropical sun in Malabar, was utterly destined to flavor the fine, expensive wine of a Roman senator, separated from its warm origin by 3 continents, countless miles, and almost a full year's unrelenting, costly travel. Each single sack of ginger or precious bolt of silk thus bore the indelible imprint of every hand that had touched it along the route. The quiet blessing of the farmer, the profound toil of the sailor, the sharp, relentless calculation of the merchant, and the sheer physical endurance of the camel driver, linking all these disparate cultures and vastly different economies into one vast, interconnected, and fragile tapestry of human desire. This immense, slow-moving exchange was recognized as the very breath of the ancient world, drawing nations together not through the fearful mechanism of conquest, but rather through the powerful, mutual, and unending human desire for things exotic and rare, for the profound and simple pleasure of unusual scent and unforgettable taste. While the majority of the spice continued its gradual western trajectory across the desert tracts, the great dhows themselves were thoroughly cleansed and refurbished in the busy ports. Their curved hulls inspected carefully for barnacles and damaging breaches, and their immense, powerful lateen sails painstakingly repaired by patient craftsmen whose skilled needles danced faster than the human eye could comfortably follow. Into the now empty, smelling holds came the return cargo, the valuable weight and bulk of the West, finely stamped silver dinars, elegant glassware that captured the harsh sunlight like solidified water, heavy, durable bales of European wool and linen, and perhaps most crucially, the delicate navigational instruments needed for the next perilous passage across the turbulent Gulf. This meticulous and painstaking preparation signaled the definitive beginning of the inevitable monsoon shift, the essential moment when the powerful trade wind was once again expected to turn its breath, demanding that the sailors abandon the relative comfort and stability of the shore and submit themselves once more to the magnificent, terrifying, and all-consuming rhythm of the open sea. They would set sail weighted not by eastern spice, but by western silver and glass, following the precise, known stars back toward the coast of India, closing the immense, grand circle of the oceanic year and preparing to face once more the long shadow of separation and the silent, humbling fury of the wide blue abyss. The memory of their families' faces, the scent of the desert dust, and the weight of their successful endeavor would remain their silent compasses as they pushed the great ships away from the harbor mouth and into the swelling tide. Soon, the dhows would be small white triangles against the vast blue dome, trusting everything they possessed, their wealth, their lives, and the future of their families, to the reliability of the stars and the immense power of the winds that governed the planet, praying that the sea deities would prove merciful one more time, allowing them passage through the treacherous straits and the towering, dark waters that lay ahead before the next inevitable season of waiting began anew on the distant shores of their homes. This perpetual motion, this endless rhythm of leaving and returning, defined the very lifeblood of the coastal peoples, whose existence was perpetually measured not by the turning of the calendars, but by the powerful, essential shifting of the monsoon winds. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening as the world settles into its quiet repose? The Nakoda, standing stern and weathered at the helm, required no charts of parchment, for his maps were etched not on paper, but upon the vast, luminous ceiling of the night sky, reading the position of the dagger and the great fish with the same natural precision that a man reads the lines upon his own palm. These ancient mariners followed the pale, guiding light of the star Suhail, which hung low and brilliant over the southern horizon, marking the path towards the familiar coasts of Gujarat and Malabar, guiding their heavy hulls through the measureless expanse of the Indian Ocean, where the only sound was the patient creaking of the timber and the endless, whispering sigh of the waves breaking against the curved wooden bow. Weeks melted into a single, vast moment of blue and gray, the sailors existing in a state of suspended time, where the concerns of land seemed trivial and far away, their lives reduced only to the immediate necessity of keeping the lateen sail trimmed and the ship pointed eastward, wholly committed to the unwavering promise of the trade winds. Then, after the long, salty months of travel, a profound and unmistakable change would arrive upon the air, long before any land was sighted, carrying the heavy, intoxicating aroma of cinnamon, clove, and damp red earth, signaling that the green, fertile embrace of the Indian subcontinent was drawing near, a promise whispered on the moist breeze. The stark, golden light of the Arabian deserts was replaced by a humid, pervasive warmth and the deep, rich shadows cast by towering palms that lined the shore, a vibrant tapestry of noise and color greeting them as they slipped the vessels into the sheltered lagoons and anchorages of the Malabar coast. Here, the silver and rough-spun linens brought from the west would exchange hands for precious cargoes of pepper and ginger, while the weary sailors tasted the sweet, fresh water and felt the solid earth beneath their feet once more, their gaze drawn to the bustling docks where 1,000 languages mingled beneath the tropical sun. The marketplaces of these ancient ports were vibrant, swirling hubs of human endeavor, where the scent of cardamom and musk hung thick in the human air, and transactions were sealed with careful, deliberate nods and the mutual respect that only shared peril can forge, with merchants debating the purity of saffron and the quality of teakwood timbers intended for faraway construction. The local traders, accustomed to the seasonal influx of the desert mariners, spoke in measured tones, their voices blending with the cries of street vendors and the rhythmic pounding of smiths, carefully observing the silver coinage brought by the ships, assessing its weight and true worth against the indispensable value of the ground spice that defined their homeland. Beyond the immediate commerce of weights and measures, the ports served as silent libraries of exchange, where scholars and navigators from distant shores shared knowledge of astronomical alignments, medical remedies, and spiritual insights, binding the disparate cultures together not merely by profit, but by a deeper, shared human curiosity about the breadth of the known world. Thus, the sailors found themselves absorbing the quiet wisdom of the Eastern philosophers, listening to the intricate rhythms of music wholly unlike their own, recognizing that the true wealth of the voyage was not solely stored in the hold, but in the expansion of the mind and the broadening of their understanding of how other men lived under different constellations. They would walk the busy streets of Calicut and Kochi, observing the grand temples and the intricate wood carvings, humbled by the antiquity and density of a culture that measured time in eras rather than in the passing of a single sailing season. This brief period ashore, while marked by feverish trade and exhausting negotiation, offered a profound spiritual respite, allowing them to anchor their transient souls in the rich soil of the East before the inevitable call of the sea pulled them away once more. The return journey, however, could not begin immediately. They were tethered now to the rhythm of the eastern shore, awaiting the precise turning of the monsoon winds that would again favor a passage toward the west, a patience demanding many long, sun-drenched months spent meticulously supervising the loading of their valuable new cargo. Every sack of pepper, every bundle of aromatic resin, and every bale of fine cotton cloth had to be accounted for, weighed, and securely stowed deep within the belly of the vessel, transforming the light, buoyant dhow into a heavy, fragrant storehouse of the East's most prized treasures, sinking perceptibly lower into the turquoise water. This process of loading was slow, painstaking labor, ensuring that the valuable contents were protected from the dampness of the ocean crossing, with expert riggers checking the integrity of every rope and timber, knowing that a single oversight could spell ruin for a year's entire enterprise. The sailors knew that the weight they now carried was immense, a responsibility far heavier than the silver they had brought, for these spices represented the desires of emperors and the essential flavors that distinguished the cuisine of half the civilized world, making the vessel a floating jewel box coveted by all who sailed the perilous waters. The very air around the ships became thick with the smell of their value, the pungent sharpness of cloves mingling with the sweet earthiness of ginger, a powerful testament to the fertility and ingenuity of the lands they were soon to depart. They treated the cargo not merely as goods, but as sacred emblems of the distant, luxurious world of the Orient, entrusted to them for safekeeping and delivery to the demanding markets of the Red Sea and beyond. As the oppressive stillness of the inter-monsoon season held the air captive, the sailors would watch the weather meticulously, noting the subtle shifts in the clouds and the changing direction of the smoke rising from the shore fires, searching for the first faint breath of the returning wind that would signal their freedom and the renewal of their westward pilgrimage. This waiting period was marked by quiet prayers and careful repairs, a deep understanding settling over them that their lives were intrinsically linked to the planetary breath, a cosmic cycle far greater than any individual human lifespan, making them humble participants in the vast, essential circulatory system of the Earth. They understood their destiny was not merely to carry goods, but to carry the very essence of interconnectedness, transporting flavor, knowledge, and desire across the barrier of the great ocean, binding the shores of the world together with their thin, winding thread of movement, season after enduring season. The day the wind shifted was always announced by a dramatic change in the quality of the light and the sudden, resolute energy in the atmosphere, signaling the end of rest and the beginning of intense labor, as the final provisions were quickly stowed and the crew prepared to wrestle the heavily laden vessels out of the harbor and into the open channel. The Nakota would stand taller now, the responsibility of the immense value carried beneath the deck pressing upon his shoulders, ensuring that every prayer and preparation had been made to appease the capricious spirits of the deep and the often furious temper of the sea. They were turning their backs once more on the stable comfort of the land, trading the certainty of the immediate shore for the uncertain promise of the distant horizon, trusting entirely in the unseen currents of the air and the precise alignment of the ancient stars to carry them and their fragile wealth safely home. With the massive lateen sails hoisted high, catching the powerful, favoring blast of the newly arrived southwest monsoon, the great dhows would surge forward, leaving the green, teeming coastlines of India behind, aimed now toward the stark, rugged coasts of Arabia, the Red Sea, and the waiting world that depended upon the flavor they carried. The heavy scent of spice would trail behind them on the water for many leagues, a fragrant memory of the lands they had just left, serving as a powerful reminder of the mission they undertook and the indispensable value of the dark, aromatic earth that had gifted them their immense payload. Their journey westward would be faster and often rougher, pushed by the sheer force of the monsoon wind that demanded swift, decisive action from every man aboard, granting them no moment of gentle repose. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The speed of the great westward crossing was intoxicating and terrifying, a sustained effort that demanded the total attention of every man aboard the vessel, for the southwest monsoon permitted no idleness and tolerated no weakness in the structure of the ship or the spirit of the crew. They moved not in a gentle glide, but in a powerful, vibrating rush, the massive steering oar requiring 2 or 3 men to hold against the relentless press of the water, while the wood of the hull groaned a constant, deep complaint, a living sound that spoke of the immense stresses being placed upon the timbers that separated them from the crushing depths below. Sleep was a snatched commodity, often taken standing or tightly curled around coils of damp rope. Yet even in slumber, the rhythmic rush of the waves against the bow acted as a constant hypnotic pulse, integrating the sailor deeply into the very motion of the sea. In the brief, clear twilight hours, the al-Muallim, the ship's master navigator, would emerge from his cramped quarters with his instruments, a piece of horn or wood known as the kamal, and gaze intensely at the quickly appearing celestial sphere, measuring the height of the pole star or the familiar alignment of the Southern Cross. His knowledge was not drawn from abstract books, but from generations of lived experience and star lore passed down by rote and song, treating the constellations not as distant pinpricks of light, but as close, reliable markers etched upon the dome of the world, guiding hands that stretched across the featureless expanse of the indigo ocean. It was an art that required absolute faith, for his calculations, taken perhaps weeks before the sight of any land, would determine whether the vessel arrived safely at a welcoming port or was dashed disastrously upon some hidden, sun-baked shore of the Arabian Peninsula. As they sped further into the open Arabian Sea, the color of the water deepened from the cloudy coastal jade to an intense, overwhelming sapphire, reflecting the dizzying height of the midday sun, yet this beautiful vastness brought its own unique terrors. Sudden squalls, born in the heat hiss of the horizon, could erupt with little warning, tearing at the immense sails with vicious claws of wind, and demanding the near impossible effort of reefing the canvas, while the deck pitched violently beneath their feet, washing the surface clean with cold sheets of salt spray. The precious cargo of pepper, cinnamon, and ginger, meticulously wrapped in reed matting and sealed beneath the deck planks, was constantly vulnerable to the stealthy intrusion of water, forcing the weary men to spend long hours pumping the bilges and listening nervously for any unnatural cracking sound within the ship's structure. Week turned into week, and the faces of the crew became etched deeper by sun and salt. But the constant westward motion of the sea began to press the sweet air of India out of their lungs, replacing it with the sharp, dry anticipation of the Near East. The air itself began to change, no longer heavy with tropical moisture, but carrying a thin, dusty scent that spoke of arid mountains and endless sand, signaling their approach to the forbidding coast of the Hadramaut or the distant Gulf of Aden. At night, the keenest eyes were kept forward, searching not for stars, but for the sudden dark profile of land that rose unexpectedly from the water, knowing that the shallow, reef-strewn approaches to these ancient coastlines were the most treacherous passage of the entire eastward voyage. The morning finally broke over a sight that caused a great collective sigh of exhausted relief to pass through the crew. The monumental, rugged silhouette of the Arabian mountains, dry and unforgiving, rising in stark, sun-baked ochre tones against the cool blue of the sky, a landscape of severe beauty that promised the return of solid earth. The massive sails were skillfully managed to harness the slowing, more controllable winds, guiding the dhows into the crowded, tumultuous waters leading toward Aden, the ancient, indispensable Eye of Yemen, which sat like a watchful fortress at the strategic mouth of the Red Sea. The journey was nearly complete, but the most difficult and complex work of the transit was only just beginning, as they prepared to anchor in a harbor famous throughout the known world for its deep water, its harsh taxes, and its staggering, violent commerce. Aden was a cacophony built of stone and ambition, a temporary resting place where the rich flavors of the East collided head-on with the demanding currency of the Western empires, Rome, Byzantium, and the rising powers of the Mediterranean. The moment the anchor chain rattled down into the murky port depths, the dhow was besieged by a swarm of small, aggressive lighters and skiffs carrying merchants, assessors, scribes, and tax collectors, all shouting in a dizzying array of languages: Arabic, Persian, Greek, and the sharp dialects of the Horn of Africa. The Nakhoda now descended into the dusty, political battlefield of the customs house, where the fate of the entire voyage's profit would be decided by careful negotiation, necessary bribery, and the relentless measure of weights and scales. The unloading was a monumental effort. Heavy sacks of pepper and bales of cinnamon bark, sealed against moisture, were hauled out from the darkness of the holds, lifted by creaking block and tackle, and stacked onto the waiting lighters under the scorching sun and the eyes of armed guards. Every single grain of spice was accounted for, transferred from the ownership of the Indian Ocean sailors into the hands of the brokers who would arrange the next stages of the journey, either by long camel caravan north through the desert kingdoms, or by smaller, specialized ships designed to navigate the notoriously difficult and shallow waters leading up toward the ports of the Red Sea, like Jeddah or Clysma. It was here, in this dusty hub of transfer, that the flavor of a faraway island was finally converted into the hard, cold value of silver and gold coinage. The dhows, temporarily emptied of their intoxicating fragrance and weight, lay gently rocking in the harbor, their hulls tended to by shipwrights who patched the monsoon damage and prepared them for the long, slower journey back east, carrying instead the solid, less volatile goods desired in India: horses, dates, wine, and above all, the massive amounts of precious metal required to fuel the spice trade. The exhausted sailors were permitted a brief, wary time ashore, tasting the unfamiliar food, hearing the strange music, and witnessing the chaotic exchange of the ancient world. Yet their hearts remained tethered to the sea and to the coming change of the wind, knowing they must soon turn their eyes back toward the sunrise and the familiar, comforting coastline they had left behind. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Deep within the city walls, far removed from the scent of brine and sweat, the great trading houses hummed with a cooler, more dangerous energy, protected by high walls and iron gates, where the true transactions of the global economy took place. Here, scribes sat cross-legged, ink staining their fingers as they meticulously recorded the weight of frankincense traded for the purity of Roman denarii, or the bulk of Alexandrian glass traded for the fiery intensity of chili pepper. Massive cedar chests, banded with dark iron, were opened to reveal staggering piles of minted silver and gold, the very lifeblood that would soon be packed carefully onto the dhows, ready to be dispersed across the subcontinent to pay the growers and the laborers who first harvested the precious commodities. This incredible transfer of wealth, driven solely by the desire for flavor and aroma thousands of miles away, represented the philosophical heart of the trade. A fleeting moment of scent converted into an enduring mountain of metal. Meanwhile, at the outer edge of the port city, where the cobbled streets dissolved into shifting sands, the desert merchants, known as the Bedouin al-Tijara, prepared their massive ships of the desert, the patient, sturdy camels. These creatures, laden with coarse woven sacks of ginger and cinnamon, knelt in the dust, their long necks swaying rhythmically while their drivers, hardened men whose skin resembled dry leather, fastened the heavy loads for the perilous trek north toward the inland empires. The weight of the spice was now measured not by the roll of the sea, but by the slow, grinding distance covered under the pitiless twin gaze of the sun and the moon, traveling under the protection of hired spears against those who would steal the profits of flavor. The aroma that once filled the humid sails of the dhows now clung to the dry woolen cloaks of the camel drivers, a faint, sweet ghost announcing their presence miles before they crested the next dune. For the sailors, time ashore was not truly rest, but a coiled waiting, a necessary pause measured by the weakening of the prevailing wind, which signaled the imminent reversal of the monsoon. They walked the docks, their eyes constantly scanning the high-flying pennants and the subtle shift in the water's surface, seeking the first whisper of the southwest wind, the seasonal breath of the gods that directed their fate. A seasoned captain named Gopal sat with his crew under the shade of a frayed sail awning, instructing the younger deckhands not in knots or navigation, but in patience, a virtue he claimed was more vital than courage, for the sea demanded exactitude in timing, not mere bravery. They understood that the great oceans only yielded passage willingly during certain months, and to defy the established rhythms of the wind was to court certain disaster, transforming profit into sunken wreckage. When the shipwrights deemed the hulls sound and the rigging fully replaced, the loading of the return freight commenced, a process far more delicate than unloading, as the cargo was alive or irreplaceable. High-spirited desert horses, highly prized by the Indian rulers for their speed and stamina, were carefully hoisted onto the decks, their panicked neighs echoing across the water until they were secured in custom-built stalls, requiring constant human attention throughout the voyage. Beneath them, deep in the securest part of the bilge, the heavy chests of silver coin and bullion were meticulously layered, protected not only by the hull, but by the silent, vigilant reputation of the captain, for this concentrated wealth was the very purpose of their long, dangerous journey. The dhows settled deeper into the water now, carrying the silent weight of civilization's accumulated treasure, a stark contrast to the light, volatile fragrance they had brought from the east. Then, one morning, the harbor master announced the change, the subtle, powerful shift in the atmosphere that heralded the monsoon's turning, bringing the promise of favorable winds for the journey back toward the eastern shores. A flurry of last-minute activity seized the port. Ropes were coiled tight, sails were unfurled and tested against the new breeze, and prayers were offered at the coastal shrines to the sea gods who controlled the water's temper. As the sun began its ascent, painting the Arabian sky in hues of deep saffron and rose, Captain Gopal gave the long-awaited command, and the great anchor was hauled up from the muddy bottom, dripping the black silt of the foreign port. One by one, the dhows turned their curved prows toward the open sea, responding instantly to the fresh, purposeful wind that filled their lateen sails, pulling them away from the dusty shore and back into the vast blue wilderness. This eastward leg of the journey, pushed by the powerful momentum of the returning monsoon, was often swifter and more consistent than the outward voyage, transforming the massive ocean into a wide, welcoming highway of water. The sailors settled into the ancient rhythm of the open ocean, watching the stars wheel overhead as they maintained their course, guided by the familiar constellations and the steady roar of the wind in the canvas high above their heads. Far below the decks, the restless horses eventually quieted, adjusting to the rocking motion, and the precious metal lay silent, only its immense weight testifying to its value, resting patiently until it could fulfill its destiny in the markets of the subcontinent. Every man aboard knew that their true task was preservation, to guard this valuable payload of animals and coins against the twin threats of storm and piracy until they sighted the distant, beloved green coastlines of their homeland. Far to the north, simultaneously, the smaller, specialized Red Sea ships had already begun their treacherous ascent up the narrow, reef-strewn corridor toward the Roman and Egyptian-controlled ports, carrying the segment of spice destined for the Western world. These vessels sailed close to shore, wary of the tricky currents and the constant threat of rocks lurking just beneath the surface, navigating by the position of familiar coastal landmarks and the changing hues of the shallow water. Their mission was a relay, a critical link in the chain, ensuring that the pepper, cloves, and cardamom harvested months ago would soon enter the dry hands of the handlers who would move them overland to the Nile, or perhaps even farther, across the great inland seas. The ultimate destination of this cargo was the wealthy tables of emperors and senators who paid an astronomical price simply to add a burst of exotic heat to their winter stews and celebratory wines. Their mission was a relay, a critical link in the chain, ensuring that the pepper, cloves, and cardamom harvested months ago would soon enter the dry hands of the handlers who would move them overland to the Nile, or perhaps even farther, across the great inland seas. Thus, in the heart of the great Indian Ocean, two distinct streams of traffic flowed simultaneously, one carrying the foundational wealth of silver and gold back to the east, and the other carrying the volatile luxury of spice toward the waiting markets of the west. This movement, invisible to the common man, but felt in every market stall from Malabar to Rome, was a testament to human longing, a longing for taste, for status, and for the tireless ambition that drove sailors, merchants, and camel drivers alike to cross immense distances, year after weary year. The rhythmic slap of the waves against Gopal's dhow whispered the silent history of nations connected by commerce, bound together by the irresistible desire for goods born of distant soils. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Gopal, a man whose skin was the color of aged teak and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of the sea, kept his hand upon the tiller, feeling the subtle tension of the rudder against the overwhelming power of the ocean currents. He navigated not merely by brittle charts drawn on parchment, which were often unreliable, but by the smell of the distant land, the behavior of the seabirds returning to their nests, and the unwavering light of the pole star that held the night sky in perfect balance. He understood that his very existence upon this endless blue canvas was a fragile contract sealed with the seasonal wind, the mighty Mausim, which dictated the movement of all things and determined when a ship might sail forth and when it must lie patiently in harbor. The knowledge of these patterns was the true wealth of the Indian Ocean captains, a secret passed down not in writing, but whispered from elder to younger, generation after generation, anchoring their fate to the breath of the world itself. Their present course aimed toward a small, sheltered cove along the Arabian coastline, a clandestine meeting point known only to certain guildmasters, far from the prying eyes of tax collectors and harbor officials who sought to diminish their hard-earned profits. Here, the small coastal vessels would unload their precious cargo, either placing it onto the backs of long, thin camels for the overland journey, or transferring it directly to the great, deep-keeled ships bound for the Red Sea and the markets controlled by distant, powerful sovereigns. The air in these transient ports was thick with the scent of brine, heavy frankincense carried from the southern deserts, and the sharp, metallic tang of newly minted copper coinage, a symphony of temporary wealth and fevered anticipation. Sailors from Ethiopia mingled with merchants whose robes suggested the far lands of Persia, all negotiating fiercely in a fragmented dialect of trade, a common tongue forged purely out of necessity and mutual, driving ambition. Yet, every sack of pepper, every bundle of cinnamon sticks, represented not just weight and flavor, but weeks of perilously close sailing, where the smallest lapse in judgment could mean the splintering of the hull and the loss of an entire fortune to the deep. The true cost of the spice was not measured in silver, but in the sweat of the rowers, the sleepless nights of the captain, and the very real possibility of meeting a sudden violent end at the hands of sea reavers who prowled the gulfs searching for unguarded opulence. It was astonishing, Gopal often mused, that a flavor so fleeting, so easily consumed, could inspire such tremendous, relentless effort and risk among men who possessed little else but courage and calloused hands. This inherent human hunger for the exotic proved that mankind valued the rare and the distant far more than the plentiful harvest found just outside their own quiet dwelling places. The act of transfer was a ritual demanding speed and absolute honesty, overseen by stern accountants who scratched figures onto clay tablets and tallied the exchange of goods against the heavy foreign currency. As the last bags of spice destined for the far-off tables of Roman banquets were hoisted away, the atmosphere shifted immediately from frenetic trade to quiet, purposeful readiness for the return voyage. The dhows were not meant to return empty. They were swiftly loaded with the valuable ballast of the West, heavy lead ingots, finely spun linen woven in the rich delta cities of Egypt, bolts of expensive Tyrian purple dye reserved only for true nobility, and the vast, beautiful heaps of silver and gold coinage. This silver, stamped with the stern, unchanging faces of the current Roman emperor, was the tireless engine of the Eastern economy, financing the next cycle of cultivation and ensuring that the farmers of Malabar would once again plant their precious crops for the demanding palates of distant empires. The circular exchange was perfect and entirely self-sustaining, demanding only two things from those who relied upon it: absolute courage to face the vast open sea, and the constant prayer that the gods of the sea would be kept eternally content with appropriate sacrifice before setting sail again toward the rising sun. The presence of such massive quantities of Roman metal spoke volumes about the West's insatiable desire, confirming that the value of Eastern flavor far exceeded the cost of their greatest treasure. Once the bulk cargo was stowed deep in the hold, personal transactions took place, where sailors acquired small trinkets and tools that were unavailable in their home ports. Items like sharp, tempered iron for repair or small bottles of strong, clear glass. Gopal watched one of his younger crewmen carefully tuck away a small, intricately carved wooden toy, clearly of Greek design, intending it for his infant child he had left waiting many weeks ago on the southern coast of India. It was in these small, personal objects, far more than in the towering piles of silver, that the true, gentle connection of the vast trade route lay exposed, a fragile thread of human devotion reaching across thousands of miles of water. On the final night before they were scheduled to depart, heading back toward the rising sun and the familiar harbors of their home, Gopal stood alone upon the deck, watching the multitude of stars wheel above the masthead. He felt himself connected not just to the generation that taught him how to read the waves, but to the millennia of sailors who had used these exact same currents, steered by the exact same constellations, carrying incense, pearls, and ivory long before Rome was even a cluster of mud huts on 7 small hills. The ocean held no memory of the names of kingdoms, only the memory of the weight of the water and the relentless pull of the moon. It treated the stronghold Tao of today with the same impartial power it treated the fragile reed boats of the pharaohs who first ventured onto these waters. He knew, with the certainty of the tide, that even if the kingdoms of the West were one day to crumble into dust, the irresistible aroma of clove and pepper would still somehow draw men across this ocean until the very sun ceased its appointed daily rising. The first soft, promising sigh of the westward wind, the very breath that would push them home, began to ripple across the sails just before dawn, stirring the rigging into a soft, hypnotic music. This wind signaled the end of the long wait in the foreign port and the urgent beginning of the next great phase of their journey, where they would race the changing season to bring the immense wealth back to the coastlines of the Indian subcontinent. The captain gave a low, resonant command, and the great triangular sails of the dhow, patched and darkened by salt and sun, began to fill, leaning into the promise of the open water. The ship slowly swung its bow away from the Arabian shore, exchanging the smells of dry desert dust for the endless, clean expanse of the deep ocean, commencing the long haul home, laden now not with spice, but with the weighty, shining tribute of the West. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the moon begins its silver climb over the deep, silent water? The dhow, christened Suhail's Shadow for the bright star that guided all travelers in the southern sky, settled into the steady rhythm of the open ocean, a sound composed primarily of the soft, continuous tearing of the water along its wooden hull and the rhythmic creak of the great mast responding to the pull of the westward current. Day dissolved into night in a slow, seamless drift, marked only by the shifting duty watches and the subtle changes in the sea's color, moving from the blinding sapphire of midday to the inky, unsettling blackness that swallowed the lower stars entirely. The crew, mostly seasoned sailors who had spent more time clinging to a pitching deck than standing on solid earth, moved with a practiced economy of motion, their sun-darkened skin glistening with the salt of 100 voyages, trusting the seasoned timbers beneath them to maintain the delicate balance between buoyancy and the crushing weight of the sea. The captain, whose face was a map drawn by sunlight and worry, stood perpetually near the steering oar, relying not on charts scratched onto fragile papyrus, but on the profound internalized knowledge of the winds and the currents that had been passed down through generations of maritime families. He knew the precise moment the migrating seabirds would appear, signaling the proximity of distant, invisible islands, and understood the slight, almost imperceptible shift in the water temperature that betrayed the presence of deep-sea mountain ranges far beneath the waves. For him, the ocean was not a boundless void, but a living network of interwoven pathways, each bearing subtle clues decipherable only to those who had paid decades of silent, patient attention to its complex language. Below deck, secured beneath the heavy planks, lay the true weight of their ambition. Solid ingots of gold, finely hammered silver bowls, bolts of western wool dyed with deep, resonant colors, and countless clay jars filled with aromatic oils that the deserts treasured. This wealth represented the full value of the pepper, the cinnamon, and the clove they had sold, translating the fleeting pleasure of flavor into the enduring, tangible form of currency, completing the ancient compact between the fertile lands of the East and the hungry markets of the setting sun. Every night, the captain would trace his hand over the worn wood above the main cargo hold, feeling the vibration of the sea against the protective shell he prayed would hold firm until they touched their own shore. As they passed the midpoint of the vast, open expanse, a subtle tension began to creep into the atmosphere, for they were now racing against the looming threat of the Kharif, the great seasonal reversal of the monsoon that could turn the gentle, following wind into a terrifying head-on fury capable of splintering their vessel. The sky, which had been a clear, impartial blue for weeks, began to display ominous signs along the horizon. Tall, anvil-headed clouds that seemed to rise up from the water itself, silent warnings of meteorological violence yet to come. It was the time of high stakes, when skill counted for less than the swiftness of the journey, and the captain ordered the mainsail trimmed tighter, urging the Suhail's Shadow onward to extract every ounce of speed possible from the forgiving wind. One evening, under a sky choked with a dense, oily haze that dimmed the usually reliable guidance of the stars, The watchman sighted a flicker of light far to the north, bobbing precariously low against the dark wash of the ocean. It was too low for a star, too steady for bioluminescence, and immediately the atmosphere on the dhow froze, the men gripping the railings in sudden, watchful silence, understanding that any other presence on the water at this distance was either a vessel in distress or, far more likely, a predator drawn by the scent of wealth and isolation. The captain commanded the lanterns to be extinguished immediately, enveloping the Suhail's shadow in absolute darkness, making it a ghost ship swallowed by the impenetrable gloom of the night. For 2 agonizing hours, they sailed in profound, absolute silence. The only sound, the unavoidable rush of the water beneath the hull, their hearts beating in time with the ocean's slow, immense pulse. The distant light remained, a mocking pinprick, neither approaching nor retreating, merely observing, forcing the captain to alter course subtly southward, sacrificing precious miles and time to avoid an inspection that could lead to ruin and bloody confrontation. It was a testament to the captain's mastery that the massive vessel, laden with its metallic treasure, moved through the black water with the quiet stealth of a hunting shark, leaving the threat far behind them to deal with the vast emptiness of the ocean. When the sun finally tore through the oppressive cloud cover the following morning, the crew breathed a collective sigh of relief, the memory of the lurking shadow fading like a bad dream under the returning dominance of the benevolent light. The captain, however, allowed himself no such luxury. The encounter was a stark reminder that the sea demanded constant vigilance, and that the vastness, while isolating, was rarely truly empty. He walked the length of the deck, ensuring every rope was securely fastened, every patch of canvas strong, knowing the true pirates of this route were not merely men, but the capricious spirits of the wind and the wave. Several days later, a profound change came over the ship's atmosphere, announced by the appearance of a very specific, small species of swallow, black and glossy, resting briefly on the uppermost rigging before continuing its relentless flight eastward. The sailors recognized this avian messenger instantly. It meant they were approaching the invisible meridian of their return journey, the latitude where the deep currents of the Arabian Sea began to bend and guide the water toward the shores of the Indian Peninsula. The sight renewed the flagging spirits of the men, exchanging the philosophical weight of the open ocean for the anticipation of the shore and the complex social world awaiting their return. The air, too, began to shift its character, slowly shedding the dry, sharp tang of the western deserts, acquiring a soft, humid density laced with the distant, unmistakable aroma of rain-soaked earth and flowering ginger. This was the scent of home, a fragrance carried thousands of miles by the same wind that propelled the sails, whispering secrets of the crowded ports, the teeming markets, and the dark soil where the valuable spices began their slow, silent journey from seed to harvest. Every inhalation was a step closer to the known comfort of their coastal cities and the familiar voices of their families. As the ship drew nearer to the great peninsular landmass, the colors of the water deepened, shifting from the pure indigo of the abyss to the vibrant turquoise and jade of the continental shelf, signaling the gradual ascent of the seafloor beneath their keel. The waves became shorter, closer together, possessed of a familiar choppy energy that spoke of shallow water and the imminent boundary between the ocean's rule and man's domain. They began passing other vessels with increasing regularity, smaller coastal craft and fishing boats, all heading towards the great ports of Calicut and Cochin, turning the solitary highway of the deep ocean into a bustling avenue of commerce. The mountain range, shrouded often in mist and the blue haze of the tropics, finally rose from the eastern horizon like the backbone of the world, immense and unchanging, a dark, welcoming barrier that promised safety from the relentless power of the sea. It was the majestic sight of the Ghats, ancient and silent witnesses to millennia of trade, The final, crucial marker that told the captain his calculated risks had paid off and that the long, hazardous compact with the ocean was finally nearing its successful conclusion. Now began the delicate dance of threading the needle through the coastal reefs, the last great challenge before the mooring ropes would hold them fast to the soil they had so long desired. Now began the delicate dance of threading the needle through the coastal reefs, the last great challenge before the mooring ropes would hold them fast to the soil they had so long desired.